Dawn rises over the Pacific in 1944 as a massive Japanese battleship cuts through the mist, believed to be untouchable behind walls of iron armor. Then, a single distant gunshot cracks the silence. Seconds later, steel buckles, water erupts, and the myth of invincibility collapses in an instant. No admiral expected what American engineers quietly built in secret laboratories: a smarter shell that could crawl beneath armor and explode from within. This hidden weapon changed naval warfare forever. Subscribe now for more forgotten stories from World War II history. By 1942, the Pacific was ruled by fearsome Japanese battleships, floating cathedrals of steel built on one belief: armor decides victory. Their naval engineers had stacked plate upon plate of hardened metal, forging belts so thick that conventional American shells simply cratered, shattered, or bounced away like pebbles thrown at a bank vault, screamed, and disintegrated on impact. Captains aboard American vessels watched through binoculars with sinking hearts. Nothing seemed to break through. Yamato's armor was so dense that naval officers joked she could ram a mountain and win. To sailors who would soon face these giants, the terror was real. A hit from Yamato's massive main batteries could fold destroyers in half. If an American ship didn't strike first, and strike deep, it simply wouldn't survive. The Pacific was so vast, so unforgiving, there would be no rescue boats, no second chances. War planners at the Bureau of Ordnance understood the stakes: build a weapon capable of defeating armor at any range, or watch Marines die on distant beaches without the guns meant to protect them. But brute force alone wasn't the answer. The United States Navy had already pushed propellant pressures and muzzle velocities near their physical limits. Fire faster, and shells shattered on impact. Lighten them, and penetration diminished. Increase explosive filler too much, and the casing weakened. The equation was merciless. On paper, there was simply no obvious way through. That frustration brewed inside Washington, D.C.'s naval gun factory, where metallurgists pored over failed shells like detectives at a morgue. Why did these rounds break? Where did the force travel? Why did some deflect at shallow angles, while others lodged harmlessly in armor belts? Every crack told a story. Every ricochet mapped a flaw. Engineers soon reached a radical conclusion. Armor didn't need to be smashed. It needed to be ignored. It wasn't about brute destruction at the surface. It was about reaching the inside of a ship where ammunition burned, pumps ran, boilers screamed, and where no armor existed at all. If an explosive could detonate deep enough, below the waterline, the ship became a tomb. And once this idea took root, nothing would ever be the same. When ordinary rounds kept failing, the problem stopped being tactical and became forensic. In Washington's naval gun factory, the white lights never quite went out. Teams of metallurgists, ordnance engineers, and ballistics experts treated each shattered shell like evidence in a murder case. They didn't ask, "How hard can we hit?" They asked, "How did it fail?" Broken casings, bent driving bands, and mushroomed noses were mapped, measured, and photographed until patterns emerged. The breakthrough began with a simple, brutal insight. Most armor defeats come from the moment of impact, when explosive force bleeds away on the faceplate and never reaches the ship's vital organs. Conventional armor-piercing projectiles either detonated too soon, shattered on contact, or lost velocity across layered protection. The result was wasted energy and ships that stayed stubbornly afloat. If you wanted to kill a battleship, you had to reach the places armor didn't cover: boiler rooms, fuel bunkers, magazines, deep inside the hull where a single internal blast could cascade into catastrophe. Designers threw out assumptions. Bigger, high-explosive fillers alone were useless if the shell never arrived intact. Faster muzzle velocity risked shattering the shell on impact. So the new approach combined weight, geometry, and timing. The Mark 8 emerged as an almost absurd compromise. An enormously heavy 2,700-pound projectile shaped with a blunt, carefully contoured nose to reduce shatter, not to pierce like a dagger. Its body used an exotic high-carbon alloy, heat-treated to a hardness that let it bite through armor without fracturing. But metallurgy was only half the equation. The fuse became the brain of the weapon. Engineers developed a delayed action mechanism that withstood the brutal shock of impact, timed precisely to detonate after the shell had cleared the outer plates and traveled into the ship's interior. Milliseconds mattered. Too short, and the explosion vented uselessly into the sea. Too long, and the shell might pass through or lodge harmlessly. Testing was methodical and brutal. Replica armor arrays were built, firing ranges extended, propellant recipes tweaked until the projectile's velocity and structural integrity matched the perfect window. The first true success, when a test round punched through multiple plates and detonated deep within a simulated hull, left observers speechless. They realized they had not only designed a shell, they had redefined what it meant to strike at sea. Designing the Mark 8 was theory. Proving it worked meant a long, noisy, expensive series of failures, and then the kind of success that makes engineers stare at one another in stunned silence. Testing moved to the Naval Proving Ground at Dahlgren, Virginia. There, engineers built full-scale armor arrays, face-hardened plates, backing structures, simulated decks, and longitudinal members, the whole messy anatomy of a battleship's protection. They fired prototype rounds from heavy guns mounted on specially prepared carriages, measuring every vibration, every crack, every fragment. Early trials were brutal. Some projectiles shattered on impact, reduced to twisted shards that left nothing but cosmetic dents. Others punched the outer plate but disintegrated inside, losing momentum before they could reach interior compartments. Each failure was logged, dissected, and fed back to the lab. Metallurgists altered compositions and heat treatments until the shell's microstructure would bend instead of break. Hard enough to cut, tough enough to survive shock. Ballistic teams experimented with nose profiles, finding that a blunt, carefully contoured tip reduced stress risers and prevented catastrophic fracture at high velocity. Powder technicians tuned propellant charges so the shell left the muzzle at a velocity high enough to penetrate, but not so violent that the casing shattered on impact. It was a terrifyingly narrow window. Then there was the fuse. Clockwork timing mechanisms were engineered to survive the first monstrous impact force, then count down milliseconds before detonating. Too short, and the explosion vented uselessly. Too long, and the shell might pass harmlessly through or lodge where it did no damage. Precision here required factory-grade machining and obsessive quality control. On a gray morning in October 1943, the pieces finally aligned. Observers watched a test firing as the projectile slammed through layered plates, continued through backing structures, and detonated deep in a simulated magazine. The blast tore through internal mock-ups the way no surface detonation ever had. Bulkheads sheared, supporting members bent, and a controlled flooding scenario proved catastrophic to the target's survivability. The control tower fell silent. Men who'd built careers on incremental improvement realized they'd created something revolutionary. Word moved up the chain with hushed urgency. The Mark 8 would remain a tightly held secret. Crews trained behind closed doors. ammunition handlers practiced slow, ritualized procedures. The weapon existed now not just on paper or in the lab, but as a proven, terrible reality. A shell engineered to die inside a ship, and, in doing so, to kill it from within. While the Mark VIII was being perfected on ranges and in labs, a class of ships built to carry it was sliding down slipways on the other side of the country. The Iowa-class battleships were unlike any capital ships afloat. Long, fast, and built to keep up with carrier task forces. These weren't the ponderous dreadnoughts of a century past. They were streamlined predators, capable of 33 knots and designed around 9 16-inch guns in triple turrets. Those guns were powerful enough on paper, but it was the ammunition that would turn them into something else. Delivery systems for a weapon that attacked a ship's insides, not its plated skin. Commissioning brought secrecy. Captains received sealed orders and classified briefings. The Mark VIII rounds were not for routine shore bombardment or harassing cruisers. They were capital ship weapons, reserved for the rarest of targets, enemy battleships and their most vital strongpoints. Magazines were segregated, shells were handled under strict procedures, crews practiced drills in hushed voices. Loading 9 2,700-pound projectiles for a broadside was choreography at the edge of human endurance. Ammunition handlers learned to respect weight and timing the way surgeons respect scalpel touch. One wrong move, and a deck could become a graveyard. Gun crews drilled with blank charges and inert rounds, rehearsing elevation tables, rangekeeper inputs, and fire control coordination with radar directors. Fire control teams ran simulated solutions that folded radar bearings, wind, powder temperature, and barrel wear into a single firing moment. Every variable mattered. The Mark VIII's effectiveness depended as much on correct firing solution as on metallurgy. A misjudged angle or excess velocity could shatter the shell or cause it to underpenetrate. Morale on board was complicated. Sailors trained for a duel that may never come, exhilarated by the sense of holding unmatched power, yet uneasy at the thought of being the instrument of instant, unstoppable destruction. They were told their shells could end fleets, but they were also told to never reveal the secret. In quiet corners below decks, veteran gunners ran their hands over inert shell casings and imagined the possibility until it became a ghostly part of the capital ships that inspired dread in admirals' war rooms remained frustratingly aloof. Battleships, the instruments the Mark VIII was built to answer, slipped away beneath cloud decks and into the night. For sailors trained to fire those secret rounds, it felt like practicing for a duel that kept getting postponed. The opportunity many aboard Iowa and her sisters had imagined arrived, only to evaporate. In October 1944, the massive clash off the Philippines, Kurita's force raked the convoy with gunfire. Heroic U.S. crews fought with improvised tactics and sheer audacity. Yet, in the end, fear of dawn airstrikes, confusion in command, and the terrifying prospect of American reinforcements convinced Kurita to pull back. He turned his flotilla away. Victory unrealized, carnage contained. For the men stationed on Iowa and New Jersey, the withdrawal was a bitter relief and a deep frustration. Their magazines stayed closed. The Mark VIII rounds remained sealed and secret. Officers later wrote of tense evenings when watchstanders scanned a dark horizon waiting for a surface meet that never quite came. The war's logic had shifted. Aircraft, not gun duels, now decided the fate of fleets. The secret shell proved its mettle in tests and shore bombardments, but the duel it had been built to win, battleship versus battleship at range, was slipping into a vanished world, replaced by planes that struck from hundreds of miles away. As the battleship duels continued to evaporate from planners' maps, the Mark 8 shell found new, unexpected ways to prove itself. Its first real combat tests didn't come against towering capital ships, but against hardened shore batteries, reinforced bunkers, and armored cruisers lurking along island coastlines. When the Iowa-class battleships opened fire, observers expected the usual concussion and secondary explosions associated with bombardment. Instead, they witnessed something far stranger: impacts that vanished inside targets, followed by internal eruptions that tore structures apart from within. It was the first public whisper of a classified secret. The heavy cruiser Kumano became a prime example. Strike logs noted a Mark 8 hit that bored through her citadel, passed through bulkheads not meant to be pierced, and detonated on the far side, severing her keel. Engineers later remarked that the cruiser was, in effect, broken in half without an external explosion. When photographs circulated, rival naval architects examined the damage in quiet horror. The rules of warship survivability they had trusted for decades suddenly felt obsolete. During the brutal fighting around Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the shells continued to demonstrate behavior no one had predicted. A fortified gun position on Iwo, buried beneath 60 feet of concrete, sand, and volcanic ash, was struck once. The shell punched downward, entered a buried magazine, and triggered a blast that collapsed an entire hillside. Marines advancing behind the bombardment reported finding nothing recognizable, just churned rubble and twisted rebar. Even Japanese field officers began whispering about phantom rounds. Their after-action reports described shells that didn't explode on contact. Instead, they disappeared, then detonated somewhere deep inside. Damage control teams found it nearly impossible to isolate flooding or fires when the source began well below the armor line. Compartments ruptured like organs in a body struck from within. Word filtered into interrogation rooms as prisoners were processed. One officer admitted, wide-eyed, that crews lost faith in armor itself. The thing they had trusted most, the thick steel plates wrapping their hulls, now invited worse destruction. Armor trapped the blast, amplified it, and turned enclosed spaces into exploding pressure vessels. Reinforced protection became a curse. Still, American sailors handling the ammunition rarely saw this carnage firsthand. They saw only the careful ritual behind the scenes. Each shell stenciled with codes, fuses inspected twice, loading drills executed by teams whose movements bordered on choreography. The men understood that when ordered to fire Mark 8 rounds, the target would be worthy of dread. These weren't shells meant for harassing fire or punching holes in concrete. They were designed to end ships, permanently, decisively. And although the grand duel, the Iowa versus Yamato showdown historians fantasize about, never arrived, the weapon quietly built a legend. Through field tests, bombardments, and accidental encounters, the Mark 8 proved something chilling. On the rare occasions it was unleashed, nothing stood between it and the heart of whatever it struck. By 1945, the Japanese Navy had learned enough to fear the unknown. Armor alone could no longer guarantee survival. And across the Pacific, American engineers watched the reports arrive with silent satisfaction. Their secret was working exactly as designed, even if the world never saw the battle it was built for. By early 1945, rumors of America's ghost shells spread through Imperial Navy briefing rooms like smoke. Officers studied penetration patterns, sketched mysterious internal blast damage, and quietly debated whether any armor on Earth could withstand this new threat. But while whispers grew louder, the moment everyone expected, the titanic gun duel between Iowa-class battleships and Yamato, never arrived. Instead, Japan gambled everything on desperation. Operation Tengo, a one-way death ride to Okinawa. Yamato, already low on fuel, would run aground on the invasion beaches, transform herself into a stationary fortress, and die taking as many American lives as possible. Admirals pretended this was strategy. Sailors understood it was suicide. American submarines spotted the task force on April 6th. The next morning, carriers launched wave after wave of attack aircraft. Torpedo planes hammered Yamato's port side. Dive bombers punched her deck armor until compartments flooded faster than pumps could fight. She never saw her gunnery ranges, never fired a broadside at American steel. After a colossal magazine explosion, bright as sunrise, Yamato rolled, capsized, and vanished beneath her own boiling oil slick. Watching from afar, Iowa and her sisters remained silent. Their magazines still held the Mark 8 shells meant for this exact enemy. The duel that naval planners had obsessed over since 1941 evaporated without a single exchanged salvo. Carrier air power had rewritten the script. Battleships became spectators at their own funeral. In Washington, analysts took notice. If aircraft could hunt capital ships beyond gun range, if missiles someday traveled farther than radar horizons, then armor, once the ultimate naval currency, was worthless weight. The era of big gun pride was ending, not with thunderous broadsides, but with silence from ships that never got their shot. For the Mark 8, destiny slipped away quietly. The perfect bullet arrived just as the battlefield moved beyond bullets forever. When the war finally ground to a halt, American naval engineers rushed to examine every surviving Japanese battleship. Among them was Nagato, once the pride of the Imperial fleet, and now battered, anchored, and awaiting her fate at Bikini Atoll. Teams descended into her armor belts, her lower decks, and her twisted bulkheads. What they found stunned even the men who designed the Mark 8 shell. There, stamped into warped steel plates, were the unmistakable signatures of deep penetration impacts, far deeper than pre-war mathematics believed possible. One hit, traced back to a shore bombardment months earlier, had driven through 16 inches of hardened armor, punched through steel framing on the far side, tunneled into a fuel bunker, and detonated in an ammunition space that, mercifully, had been emptied. Engineers measured the total penetration distances, recalculated angles, and quietly realized this weapon hadn't just met expectations. It had exceeded them. Worse for Japan, investigators realized their armor, while enormous, was tailored to defeat their own naval shells. The specific hardness and elastic properties were almost perfectly mismatched against the American alloy. By sheer coincidence, the Mark 8's nose hardness and grain structure exploited weaknesses. Japanese armor wasn't built to resist. It was engineering brilliance colliding with industrial blind spots. Meanwhile, locked in filing cabinets at the naval gun factory, data revealed something even more unsettling. Simulated duels between Yamato and Iowa suggested those massive armor belts wouldn't have saved her, not from repeated internal detonations delivered below the waterline. Flooding would have cascaded downward like a sinkhole, collapsing bulkheads from the inside out. Armor, Yamato's entire philosophy, would have worked against her. Suddenly, the mythology of invincible battleships looked naive. And then came the strategic revelation. If brute armor could be cracked, if perfect protection was an illusion, then naval warfare no longer needed thick steel belts at all. Post-war fleets pivoted to radar, missiles, electronics, and speed. Battleships became relics overnight, too heavy to defend themselves against threats they were never built to stop. Quietly, naval architects admitted a truth few wanted to say aloud. The Mark 8 hadn't just killed ships, it killed the idea of the battleship. In the decades that followed, the Iowa-class battleships drifted between museums, mothball fleets, and sudden recalls to war. Korea, Vietnam, Lebanon, even the Gulf War. Each time, deep inside their armored hearts, Mark 8 shells still waited in the magazines, quiet, unchanged, staring through time like relics from a forgotten duel. Crews trained with them, loaded them, polished their casings, but the ocean never again offered a worthy target. Missiles streaked across horizons, and air power ruled from distances battleship guns could never reach. When the battleships were permanently retired in the 1990s, naval historians walked their decks and felt something eerie. The most advanced armor-piercing shell ever built never fought the battle it was designed for. It was a champion without an arena, a weapon perfected just as its battlefield vanished beneath it. Today, you can stand in the cool, dim magazines of USS Iowa or USS Missouri and see a few of these giants resting behind plexiglass. Tourists read the labels and move on, but engineers linger. They know these shells represent the final chapter of an age, the peak of mechanical warfare before electronics rewrote everything. Look closely, and you'll see stenciled warnings. Capital targets only. A reminder of the battle that never came. In their silence, the Mark 8s teach a quiet lesson. Power isn't always about size. Innovation can unmake the old world in a single spark of insight. And sometimes, history ends not with thunder, but with technology arriving one moment too late. Subscribe for more hidden truths the textbooks forgot.